The town of Blackridge was a place forgotten by time. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, its population had dwindled over the years until only a handful of families remained. The town had no modern convenience as no phone lines, no internet, and no real roads leading out. It was as if it had been left untouched for centuries, preserved in a strange, quiet decay. Travelers who stumbled upon it rarely stayed long. There was something wrong about Blackridge. Lena and her brother Daniel weren't travelers. They had lived in Blackridge their entire lives. Their parents, like everyone else, never spoke about what lay beyond the town's borders. The stories had always been the same. There was nothing out there but endless woods. But Lena knew better. There were things in those woods. She had seen them. It started when she was 8 years old. She had wandered too far from the main road one evening, drawn by a strange sound like whispering voices carried by the wind. She followed the sound through the trees, her small hands brushing against the rough bark as the sky darkened. And then, suddenly, she saw it. A figure stood deep within the forest. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its body impossibly thin. Its skin was the color of ash, and it had no eyes. Just empty sockets that seemed to swallow the light. Lena had been frozen in place, her breath caught in her throat. The thing tilted its head at her, as if studying her. Then, slowly, it smiled. That was when she heard her mother's voice. Except, it wasn't her mother. It was the thing, and it was calling her name. Lena ran. She never spoke of it again. Years passed, but the memory never faded. Daniel didn't believe her, of course. He was the older sibling, the skeptic. He dismissed the stories about Blackridge, about the things in the woods, about the whispers at night. Ghost stories, he had said. Just stupid old legends. But then, people started disappearing. It began with the townspeople. A woman named Mrs. Calloway, then old Mr. Grayson. A boy from school. One by one, they vanished. No bodies. No evidence. Just gone. No one talked about it. It was as if they had never existed. Then, one night, Daniel disappeared too. Lena woke up to silence. Her brother's bed was empty. The front door was slightly ajar. And outside, in the thick of the woods, she could see them. The figures, standing in the trees, watching, waiting. She grabbed a flashlight and ran. The woods were darker than she had ever seen them. The trees shifted, as if alive, their twisted branches forming shapes that shouldn't exist. The air was too still, thick with something she couldn't describe. And ahead of her, the whispers began, Daniel's voice, calling for help. She ran toward the sound, her feet crushing the damp leaves beneath her. The flashlight beam flickered, struggling against the unnatural darkness. And then, she saw him. Daniel stood in the clearing, his back turned to her. His clothes were torn, his posture unnaturally rigid. She called his name. Slowly, he turned. His face wasn't right. His eyes were missing. His mouth stretched into a grin too wide for his face. And then, in a voice that wasn't his own, he whispered, "You shouldn't be here." Lena's blood ran cold. She stumbled backward, heart hammering against her ribs. Daniel took a step forward. Then another. Then another. His movements were wrong, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. Then she saw them. The figures, emerging from the trees, their bodies blending with the darkness. Their limbs were long, their fingers sharp, their faces empty, just hollowed out spaces where eyes should be. The whispering grew louder, a chorus of voices. Some sounded like people she knew, some sounded like herself. The shadows moved, the trees breathed. She turned to run, but the path was gone. The town was gone. There was only the woods, only the whispers. And then, from the darkness, a hand reached out, cold, thin, raw, fingers wrapped around her wrist. The whispering stopped. The world went black. Lena woke up in her bed. The morning sun streamed through her window. She gasped, sitting up, heart pounding in her chest. Had it been a dream? A nightmare? She turned her head. Daniel's bed was still empty. Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she stood up and walked to the window. The town outside looked normal. The streets, the houses. But something was off. Then, she noticed the people. They were all standing still, not moving, not breathing. Their faces were turned toward her house, and every single one of them was smiling. Her phone buzzed. A single message. Unknown number. You never left. She dropped the phone. In the mirror across the room, her reflection didn't move. It just smiled and whispered, "We have you now." Then the lights flickered and everything went dark. Lena never told anyone what happened that night because there was no one left to tell. The town of Blackridge had always been quiet, but after that night, it became something else entirely. It was like a place preserved in time, frozen in decay. The people were still there, standing in their houses, walking through the streets, sitting on porches, but they weren't people anymore. They didn't talk, they didn't blink, and they all smiled. Daniel was gone, and Lena knew deep down she was next. She had to get out. She packed a bag before the sun had fully risen, stuffing it with food, a flashlight, and whatever else she could find. She didn't know where she would go. Blackridge was isolated, cut off from the world, but she didn't care. She had to run. She crept down the stairs, avoiding the warped wood that creaked. The house was too silent. The walls felt like they were listening. The front door stood slightly open. She didn't remember leaving it that way. A cold breeze drifted inside. Lena stepped closer and stopped. There was something waiting outside, standing in the road, watching. She recognized the shape instantly. Tall, thin, not human. It had no eyes, but she knew it was looking right at her. She didn't stop to think. She ran through the back door into the trees, her heart hammering against her rib. The woods were different now. The trees shifted as she ran, twisting unnaturally, forming paths that hadn't been there before. The air was thick, pressing down on her chest. And then, the whispering started again. Soft at first, then louder. Lena clenched her teeth, pushing forward. She didn't look back. She didn't stop, because she knew what would happen if she did. She ran for what felt like hours. Her legs burned, her lungs screamed. Then, the trees opened, and she saw it. A road. A real road. Black pavement stretched into the distance, disappearing into the hills. She gasped, nearly sobbing. She had done it. She had escaped. She stumbled forward, her body trembling. And then, headlights appeared. A car. An actual car. She waved her arms, stepping into the road, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The car slowed, the tires crunching over gravel. The driver's window rolled down. A man sat inside, maybe in his late 50s. His face was lined, his expression concerned. "You all right, miss?" Lena's voice broke as she spoke. "You have to get me out of here." The man hesitated, glancing toward the forest. Then he nodded. "Get in." Lena nearly collapsed into the passenger seat. The door shut. The car rolled forward. She was safe. She was free. The man drove in silence for a long time. Lena's hands wouldn't stop shaking. She stared out the window, watching the trees blur past. Then, finally, the man spoke. "You from around here?" Lena shook her head. "Number I was visiting." She didn't want to tell him the truth. She didn't want to say she had spent her whole life in a town that shouldn't exist. The man nodded, his eyes on the road. "Hell of a place to visit." Lena swallowed. "You ever heard of Blackridge?" she asked. The man's hands tightened on the wheel. His expression darkened. "Can't say I have." She frowned. "But it's right back there. The town, the houses, the people." The man didn't look at her. His voice was flat. "There's nothing back there." Lena's stomach twisted. "No, I swear." The man sighed. "Look, miss, I've been driving this highway for 20 years. There's no town in those woods. Not anymore." Lena froze. Her breath caught in her throat. "Not anymore." She turned, and the road behind them was gone. The forest was gone. There was only darkness, and the whispering had followed her. Lena didn't sleep that night. She checked into a small roadside motel, locking the door behind her, pulling the curtains closed. She was safe. She was out. But something didn't feel right. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with her reflection. It had started in the car. She caught a glimpse of herself in the side mirror, and for just a second, her reflection was smiling, even though she wasn't. Room mirror, staring, her reflection stared back, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for something. She turned away. The light flickered. Then, a sound, soft, barely a whisper. Lena turned slowly. Her reflection wasn't facing her anymore. It was turned away, looking at something behind her. Lena's breath hitched. She turned, and there was nothing there. Just her empty motel room. Her phone buzzed. A text message. No number. No sender. Just 3 words. "You never left." The mirror shattered, and something stepped out. Then, darkness. The town of Blackwater Pines was the kind of place that didn't exist on maps. If you stumbled upon it, you were already too deep in the wrong direction. It wasn't a place people moved to. It wasn't a place people left. It simply was a relic of time, buried beneath the weight of its own history. When Nathan Holloway first arrived, the air felt thick, as if something old and watching had been waiting for him. The letter in his pocket was still crumpled from how many times he had read it. "Your grandfather has passed. The estate is now yours. Return immediately." Nathan had never met his grandfather, but now Blackwater Pines was his. The Holloway estate stood on the edge of town, overlooking the Black Pines forest, a stretch of trees so dense that even the sun barely reached the ground beneath them. The mansion itself was monstrous, an old Victorian structure with twisted iron gates and windows that watched you back. The inside smelled of damp wood and something rotting beneath the surface. The walls were lined with old portraits, each one depicting a Holloway ancestor. Nathan stepped deeper inside. The air shifted, and then he heard it. A whisper. Not loud, not clear, but something just beneath the sound of the wind curling through the halls. Nathan turned. A shadow moved at the top of the grand staircase, but when he blinked it was gone. The first night in the house, Nathan dreamed of the forest. The trees moved when no wind touched them. A figure stood between them, tall, thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted unnaturally. Nathan couldn't move. The thing smiled, or at least, it did something that felt like smiling. And then, it spoke. "You should not have come back." Nathan woke, gasping for air. And then he realized the whisper hadn't stopped. It was still in the room with him. The days that followed only got worse. Doors opened on their own. The portraits changed. Faces that once held blank stares smiled when he passed. The mirrors no longer showed him alone. Nathan tried to convince himself it was just the house settling. The kind of tricks an old mansion played on someone not used to silence. But Blackwater Pines was not silent. It was watching, waiting. On the fourth night, the dreams got worse. This time, he wasn't alone in the forest. The trees moved again, but no so did the ground beneath him. Something was buried there. Hands pushed through the dirt, clawing their way up. Nathan turned to run, but the figure was behind him now, closer. Its head tilted in that impossible way. Its mouth stretched too wide. "You cannot leave," it whispered. Nathan woke up outside the house, standing at the edge of the forest. Barefoot, dirt on his hands, fingernail scratches on his wrists, and in the distance, something was still watching. He needed answers. He found them in the basement, behind the old bookshelves, behind a hidden door he had never noticed before. A room filled with journals. Generations of Holloway men had written in them, all saying the same thing. The forest is alive. The house belongs to it. And once you are called back, you cannot leave. Nathan flipped to the last entry. It was dated the night before his grandfather died. "I see them in the trees. I hear them in the walls. I know now I was never meant to leave, and neither is he." Nathan's hands trembled. A shadow moved in the corner of the room. He turned, and something was standing there. The whispering filled his ears. He tried to scream, but before he could, the candle went out, and everything went black. The next morning, the town of Blackwater Pines continued as if nothing had happened. Nathan Holloway was never seen again. But if you stand at the edge of the Black Pines forest, on the nights when the wind is still, you can still hear the whispering. And if you listen long enough, you'll hear him whisper back. Nathan Holloway should not have been alive. He should not have been breathing. Should not have been standing here. Should not have been staring into the twisted depths of Black Pines Forest. He had been taken. He had felt the darkness wrap around his throat, pulling him into the earth. He had heard the whispers crawl beneath his skin. And yet, here he was. But he was not alone. Not anymore. The town of Blackwater Pines remained unchanged. Its people still moved like clockwork, their faces blank, their voices hollow. Nathan walked the streets, unseen, unnoticed, like a ghost among the living. He tried to speak to them, but they never looked at him, never acknowledged him, as if he had never existed at all. The only thing that noticed him was the house. The Holloway estate stood as it always had, looming, waiting, watching. But something about it was different now. The windows were darker, the walls more withered, the iron gates standing slightly open in invitation. Nathan hesitated, but his feet moved on their own. The house swallowed him whole the moment he stepped inside. The air was thick, rotting, the walls pulsing faintly like something alive. The portraits on the walls had changed his face, was there now, but he was not alone in them. A figure stood behind him in every painting, tall, twisted, watching. Nathan exhaled sharply. "What do you want?" The house breathed. A whisper curled through the hallways. "You already know." Nathan turned toward the grand staircase. At the top stood a man, his grandfather, or at least something wearing his skin. The thing that looked like Elias Holloway smiled in a way no human should. "You came back," it murmured. Nathan's fists clenched. "You brought me back." His grandfather tilted his head too far, the bones cracking. "No, Nathan, you never left." The shadows around him shifted. The house groaned. Nathan stepped back. The portraits watched him. Their eyes followed his every move. And in the reflection of the dusty mirror beside the staircase, Nathan saw something move behind him, something that wasn't there. The dream started again that night. Nathan didn't sleep, but the dream still found him. The trees in the forest stretched taller, their branches clawing at the sky. The ground beneath him breathed, shifting, restless. The whispers grew louder, and then he saw it. The figure, the one that had haunted him. It stepped forward from the trees, its limbs too long, its mouth stretching into something not human. Nathan couldn't move. It reached for him, cold, dead fingers curling around his wrist. And he woke up in the forest, barefoot, dirt under his nails. His own footprints leading back to the Holloway estate. He had to end this. There had to be a way to break the cycle. Nathan searched the house. He ripped through the walls, tore apart the books, dug into the hidden places his ancestors had tried to keep buried. And that's when he found the well. Deep beneath the estate, behind a door that should not have existed, lay a circular stone well, its edges carved with symbols he did not recognize. The air was wrong down here. Heavy. Hungry. Nathan stepped closer. And then he heard it. A heartbeat. Coming from the well. Something moved in the darkness below. And a voice, his grandfather's voice, spoke from behind him. "You don't want to see what's down there, Nathan." Nathan turned slowly. Elias Holloway stood in the doorway, but his face wasn't human anymore. His skin was stretched too tight, his eyes black, his mouth pulled into a grotesque grin. The shadows curled around him, clinging to his body like a second skin. "You were never meant to leave," the thing whispered. Nathan's breath came fast, uneven. "What is this place?" The thing laughed. "This place is what it has always been," it said, stepping closer. "A doorway, a bridge, a place where the old things come to feed." Nathan's stomach turned. "Feed on what?" The thing smiled wide. "You." The well began to tremble. The whispers became screams. Nathan stumbled back as something began to rise from the depths. Something with too many limbs, too many eyes, too many mouths, whispering in unison. "It's your turn now, Nathan." The walls shook violently. The air ripped apart. Nathan grabbed the nearest object to rusted iron rod and ran. The thing that had once been his grandfather chased him. The house twisted around them, the hallways shifting, stretching longer, deeper, endless. Nathan's vision blurred. He wasn't going to make it. And then he saw the door. It was already closing. Nathan threw himself forward. His fingers brushed the handle, and then blackness. When he opened his eyes, he was standing in the middle of Blackwater Pine. The town was silent. The Holloway estate was gone, and Nathan was alone. Or at least, that's what he thought. Until he turned toward the forest and saw a figure, watching, waiting, with his own face. And when it smiled, Nathan finally understood. He had never left, and he never would.
Her eyes were missing, and yet she was smiling. Eric's scream was swallowed by the fog. The next morning, a new traveler arrived in Hollow Pines. A man, lost, his GPS failing. He saw the welcome sign at the edge of town. Population 347. Eric Donovan gasped awake. His breath came in sharp, ragged pulls, his chest heaving as if he had been suffocating in his sleep. The car engine was dead. The thick fog still loomed outside, swirling unnaturally around the trees. His passenger seat was empty again, but something had changed. The Welcome to Hollow Pine sign was still standing at the town's edge. But now, the population count had gone up. Population 348. His stomach clenched. Eric reached for his phone, his fingers trembling. Still no signal, no GPS, no internet, no connection to the outside world. His car wasn't moving, it wouldn't start. Something in his gut told him it wouldn't. He turned toward the road, leading out of town. Only the road was gone. A wall of trees stood in its place. Thick, ancient oaks with black, twisted bark, roots coiling through the asphalt like veins. The trees hadn't been there when he drove in, and yet they had always been there. Sputtered, the radio flickered on. Static. And then a voice. "You shouldn't have stayed." Eric's blood turned to ice. The rearview mirror darkened. A shadow moved behind the car. He turned. Nothing was there, but he could feel it. Something was watching him. His pulse pounded. He shoved the door open, stepping onto the pavement. The air was thicker than before, heavier, as if the town itself had grown denser, its presence pressing down on him. He wasn't alone. The town was different now. The houses on Main Street looked older, more decayed. The paint peeled in long, curling strips. The windows were shattered. The streetlights flickered, their glow barely cutting through the unnatural darkness. And worst of all, the gas station was open again. A neon sign buzzed faintly. The same sign that had gone dark the night before. And standing in front of it was the clerk. Only now, he had no face. His skin was smooth, featureless. A blank canvas stretched over his skull. But somehow, Eric could feel him smiling. His breath caught in his throat. The clerk raised one finger to his lips. Shh! Eric took a step back. The door of the gas station creaked open, and inside was himself. Eric's own reflection stood behind the counter. Not a mirror, not a trick of the light. Another version of himself. Except it wasn't him. The other Eric tilted his head, grinning. "You should have left." Eric stumbled back, heart hammering against his ribs. The entire town breathed. A deep, groaning sound echoed through the streets, like wood and stone shifting beneath unseen weight. Something moved in the windows of the abandoned buildings. Figures, watching, waiting. Eric turned and ran. He sprinted down the empty street, past the diner, past the decayed houses, past the places that shouldn't exist. The town was changing around him. The buildings stretched taller. The roads curved where they hadn't before. New alleyways opened up dark and endless. He reached the church at the end of the street. The doors were open. Inside, candles flickered, and someone was waiting. A woman in black. Her face was hidden beneath a veil. Her hands, pale and thin, rested on the altar. She stood perfectly still, as if waiting for him. His body refused to move forward. Her head tilted. She knew his name. Eric Donovan. His blood ran cold. She lifted her hands. The candles flickered out. The town went dark. Eric wasn't in Hollow Pines anymore. He was somewhere else. The air was thick with mist. The ground beneath his feet was not pavement, not earth, but something soft, something breathing. The whisper started, not from one voice, from hundreds. A chorus of voices murmuring in unison. You belong here now. His pulse thundered. He turned to run, but there was no exit. Only darkness. Only the voices. And then, hands grabbed his wrists. Then, cold fingers. They pulled him downward. Into the dark. Into the town. Into Hollow Pines. The next morning, a new traveler arrived in town. A woman lost. Her GPS failing. She saw the sign at the edge of the road. Welcome to Hollow Pines. Population 349.
The asylum had been abandoned for decades, or at least, that's what people believed. The world had long forgotten Ravenwood Sanatorium, its halls once filled with the screams of the damned. Nestled deep within the Appalachian woods, it had been sealed shut in the 1960s after reports of unimaginable horrors. Patients went missing, doctors disappeared, and those who entered were never the same when they came out, if they ever did. But no one stays forgotten forever. Elliot Grayson was an urban explorer. He had broken into dozens of abandoned places, befouled malls, hospitals, train stations, but nothing like this. The asylum loomed in the moonlight, its rotting walls covered in creeping ivy, its windows shattered, and its doors barely hanging on rusted hinges. As he stepped inside, the air grew heavy. The stench of mold and something rotting filled his lungs. His flashlight flickered. The entrance hall stretched into darkness. The walls lined with peeling patient files, old wheelchairs, and chains hanging from the ceiling. Then, the first whisper. "Why did you come?" Elliot froze. His breath hitched. He spun around. No one was there. He pushed deeper inside. The rooms were still filled with hospital beds, restraints still attached. The walls were covered in scratch marks. Some were too high oopas if something had been crawling on the ceiling. The whisper returned. "They see you." Elliot's stomach twisted. Thin a footstep. Not his own. Something was behind him. He turned his flashlight toward the hallway. A woman stood there. Her hospital gown was torn, her skin stretched too tight, her mouth sewn shut with black thread. She didn't move. Then her head snapped sideways, the bones cracking loudly, and she screamed. Elliot ran. His flashlight died. The halls stretched impossibly long, the doors vanishing as soon as he passed them. The asylum wasn't letting him leave. He saw movement in the corner of his eye. Figures in hospital gowns, standing in doorways, their faces blurred, their mouths whispering in languages he couldn't understand. Then, the lights flickered on. For a split second, he saw them clearly. Their eyes were gone. Their mouths were sewn shut. Their arms stretched too long. Their fingers digging into the walls. Then, the lights died again. The whisper turned into a growl. "Run." Elliot bolted through the hallway. His footsteps echoed too many times. He wasn't alone. The hall ended at an old metal door, covered in bloody handprints. A surgical light flickered inside. Elliot had no choice. He stepped through, and the door slammed shut behind him. The operating table in the center was covered in fresh blood. Scattered across the floor were surgical tools, broken bones, and something wet, twitching. Thena's shadow moved in the corner. Elliot turned. A doctor stood there, wearing a rotting surgical mask. But his hands, they were covered in long black stitches. Moving on their own, the skin writhing like something was alive underneath. The doctor lifted a scalpel. "Time for your procedure." The whispers screamed. The lights died. A sharp pain pierced Elliot's chest. Then, everything went black. The next morning, the sun rose over Ravenwood Asylum. The door was wide open. Elliot's camera was found near the entrance, its screen glitching. His car was still parked outside, but he was gone. His footage revealed one last frame. A distorted, shaking image of the operating room. A man in a surgical mask, standing over the camera. The doctor's eyes were black pits, and he was smiling. "You're next." The sun never fully rose over Ravenwood Asylum. A thick mist clung to the trees like rotting flesh, curling between the twisted branches as if something unseen was breathing through the forest. The asylum had been sealed for years, yet the door now stood slightly ajar, swinging ever so gently as if welcoming something back inside. Elliot Grayson never really left. The world assumed he had vanished, swallowed whole by the darkness that had claimed Ravenwood decades ago. But Elliot existed in a place between. Not dead, not alive. Trapped in a cycle that no one could understand, except those who had suffered the same fate before him. The camera he had carried was found outside, its footage corrupted with glitched images of the asylum's decaying halls. In some frames, his face could be seen, blurred, twisted, like he was trying to claw his way out of the screen. His final words had been caught in the audio, barely a whisper beneath the static. "It knows I'm here." But nobody ever listened. Nathan Mercer was a journalist who specialized in urban legends. He had chased stories of haunted houses, cursed forests, and phantom towns. But nothing had drawn him in like the case of Elliot Grayson. The missing explorer had become a myth, his disappearance shrouded in conspiracies that ranged from government cover-ups to supernatural intervention. But Nathan wasn't interested in theories. He wanted proof, and proof was waiting for him inside Ravenwood. The entrance gaped like a mouth, the scent of mold and decay thick in the air. The walls pulsed as if alive, breathing in the cold drafts that slithered through the broken windows. Nathan's footsteps echoed as he moved through the long corridor, camera in hand, flashlight flickering with every step. Something felt wrong. There were no animals, no sounds. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing against his skin as though the asylum itself was watching him. Then, the first whisper. "He's still here." Nathan turned sharply, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dust-laden air. The hallway stretched endlessly behind him, the peeling wallpaper curling away like old dead skin. No one was there. Thena's shadow. It darted across the far end of the hall, Too fast, too distorted. His fingers tightened around his camera as he moved forward, heart hammering in his chest. The doors to the patient room stood slightly open, revealing rusted bed frames, yellowed sheets, and medical tools left untouched for decades. The air smelled of something rancid. Then, the sound. A chair scraping against the floor. Nathan's breath caught as he aimed his camera into one of the rooms. A lone wheelchair sat in the corner, rocking ever so slightly as if someone had just pushed it. The walls were covered in scratches deep, jagged letters carved into the rotting wood. "Let me out." The sound of bones cracking echoed behind him. Nathan spun around. A figure stood at the end of the hallway. Tall, unmoving. The light flickered. For a split second, Nathan saw stretched, pallid skin, hollow black eyes, and a stitched mouth that twitched against the threads. Then, darkness. The flashlight died, and the whispers returned. "They're coming." Nathan ran. The halls twisted, stretched, became something unnatural. Every door he passed now stood open, and inside, the shadows of patients sat in their beds, their heads turning in unison to follow his movement. Their mouths opened wide, silent screams trapped behind lips that should have never moved. Something was chasing him. He felt it, heard it. The rasping breath, the sickening sound of something dragging against the floor. A presence, heavy, looming just behind him. He reached the end of the hall. The metal door was covered in handprints, some human, some not. Nathan pushed through. The operating room stretched before him, and the air turned thick with the scent of blood. The walls were moving, shifting with something unseen beneath the surface. In the center of the room, the operating table sat waiting. A body lay on it. Nathan hesitated, then stepped closer. His camera trembled in his grip. The body was wrapped in decayed bandages, its skin gray, its hands twisted in unnatural angles. But it wasn't the body that made Nathan's stomach turn. It was the face. Elliot Grayson. His eyes were open, hollow black pits staring at nothing. His lips were sewn shut, but the stitches were fresh, wet with something dark. His chest moved. A breath. Nathan staggered back as Elliot turned his head. The stitches ripped apart as he screamed. The lights shattered. The walls collapsed inward. Nathan fell, his camera clattering to the ground as the world twisted into a spinning mass of darkness and voices, so many voices. Then, silence. The next morning, the asylum stood untouched. The door was closed. Nathan's car was still parked outside, but Nathan Mercer was gone. His camera was found in the dirt, covered in blood. The footage inside was distorted, filled with flickering images of something crawling through the walls, of black eyes watching from every direction. And one final frame, a man standing in the middle of the asylum's hall, his mouth stitched shut, his eyes locked onto the lens. The face was no longer Elliot's. It was Nathan's. The town of Ravenwood had no past, at least not one that was spoken about. The asylum had been a relic of a time long buried, its history swallowed by decay and silence. But some things never truly die. The air in the town still carried the weight of its horrors, the whispers that had never ceased, and the restless spirits that lurked within the abandoned halls of its darkest creation. Nathan Mercer had vanished without a trace. His last known location was Ravenwood Asylum. His car had been found, his camera lying in the dirt, its screen flickering with distorted images of something that should not have been seen. His name was added to the list of those who had entered but never returned. Months passed. Then, another visitor arrived. Rachel Harlow had been Nathan's closest friend, a fellow journalist who had warned him against his reckless investigations. When he had sent her his last message, just a single text reading, "I think I found him." He's not dead. She had known he was in danger.